And thanks for this opportunity to speak about Australia's engagement with Asia from the perspective of trade, and in particular to say a few words about what Austrade is doing in this space. I'm particularly pleased to be addressing trade and investment, not just, of course, because these two things are inextricably linked, but also, of course, because Austrade reports to Australia's first ever Minister for Trade and Investment. Asia's importance to Australia's economy is growing by the day. It is one of the most important factors to consider when assessing the international conditions for our national prosperity. Asian demand for our exports has helped Australia manage the global financial crisis better than most other developed economies, in fact probably better than all other developed economies. And investment from Asia has added to the productive capacity of the economy and to overall productivity. In 2013, 7 of our top 10 export markets were in Asia and represented 65% of our total exports. Asian markets and Australia's geographic proximity are critical, not just for our trade ties and our capacity to access important global supply chains, but also to the level of foreign investment in Australia. FDI has grown markedly in Australia over the past decade. In fact, it has more than doubled from about $292 billion to $630 billion in 2013.
The brain is basically built from the bottom up. First, the brain builds basic circuits that are responsible for basic skills, and then more complex circuits are built on top of those basic circuits as we develop more complex skills. Biologically, the brain is prepared to be shaped by experience. It's expecting the experiences that a young child has to literally influence the formation of its circuitry. It's built into our biology. The interaction between genetics and experience that shapes brain architecture is embedded in the reciprocal relationships that children have with the adults in their lives. And by that we mean what we refer to as the serve and return nature of children's interaction with their adults. Development and the impact of experience on development is not a one-way street. It's a back and forth interaction. The brain is a highly integrated organ which has multiple sections that specialize in different kind of processes. So we have parts of the brain that are involved more in cognitive function, and other parts that are involved in processing of emotion, and parts involved in seeing and hearing. So if a child is emotionally kind of well put together and socially competent, that will affect more positive and productive learning. And if a child is preoccupied with fears or anxiety, or is dealing with considerable stress, no matter how intellectually gifted that child might be, his or her learning is going to be impaired by that kind of emotional interference.
NASA has just released a new image captured by the Hubble Space Telescope, revealing what it looked like moments before galactic clusters, cosmic clusters that consist of many galaxies held together by gravity smashed into each other. The result of this cosmic collision of galaxy clusters was the formation of a new massive structure called MAX J0416.1 2403, or simply MAX J0416, that lies roughly 4.3 billion light years from Earth in the constellation Eridanus. Pictures of galactic clusters sometimes don't look real because every single one of the tiny, stereotypically spiral disks in the image above looks an awful lot like they were just photoshopped haphazardly onto a black background. But these images are completely real and also incredible because each one of those galaxies contains billions of stars and countless planets, just like our own Milky Way contains the planets and the stars of our solar system. To create the image above, which the team is calling the Cosmic Kaleidoscope, researchers combined data captured by 3 different telescopes set to capture individual parts of the sky. As the team explains, the image of the cluster combines data from 3 different telescopes: the NASA/ESA Hubble Space Telescope showing the galaxy and stars, the NASA Chandra X-ray Observatory diffuse emission in blue, and the NRAO Jansky Very Large Array diffuse emission in pink. Each telescope shows a different element of the cluster, allowing astronomers to study MAX J0416 in detail.
The way a mother rat takes care of its pups is by licking and grooming, nipple switching, and archback nursing. So the rats that do a lot of licking and grooming, and there are rats that do very little, but most rats are in between. So that resembles human behavior as well, right? You have mothers that are highly mothering and mothers that couldn't care less, and most mothers are somewhere in between. So if you look at these rats, so all you do, you observe them and you put them in separate cages. So you put the high lickers in one cage, not the mothers, but the offspring, and the low lickers in another cage. And then you let them grow, and they're adults now. Their mothers are long buried. And you look in the brain, and you see that those who had high licking mothers express a lot of glucocorticoid receptor gene, and those who are low lickers express very little. That reflects a number of receptors. And that results in a different stress response. But this is not the only difference. We found later on there are hundreds of genes that are differently expressed. So if you get a mutation, a polymorphism once in a million, here just the motherly love changes hundreds of genes in one shot. And it changes them in a very stable way that you can look at the old rat and you can say whether it was licked or not. But you can also say it by behavior. So if you walk to the cages, to the room, the rats that were poorly licked are highly anxious, hard to handle, aggressive. And the rats that were very well handled as little pups, they are much more relaxed, much easier to handle. So, like every technician in the lab knows, looking at the adult rat, how it was licked when it was a little pup. And the question, of course, is mechanism. How does this work?
During this time, my goals are going to be to talk about the phenomenon that we may share in part with other animals, unlike our language, and that is emotion. And also talk about some new technology, brain imaging, functional magnetic imaging. And we try to answer some very old questions about how does motivation and emotion work. I'm going to put you with the scenario first, and some of you may be familiar with. This was developed by Pavlov over a century years ago. And in this scenario, the dog was presented with the sound, and then the dog waits, and then fed food powder, and this happened repeatedly. Things started to happen in the middle of the experiment there. Interesting things started to happen here. Pavlov's study was to salivate the dog. The salivation increased more time to paralyze. But other things happened here too. You have a dog move around here more, and all kinds of things are going on here. What we trying to capture was the experiment I'm going on to describe today, is what is going on in the brain to generate that state, which we called it competitive state. But you can also think about state in terms of how are the dogs feeling later. How are you feeling about eating lunch today?
Starts right now.
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible, with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories, and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories, and the smog soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it, it's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world.
Thirdly, life from non-living matter. And this illustration often used is the one of the monkeys at the typewriter. Okay, so we have a monkey sitting at a typewriter, and the claim here is basically if you leave chance and time long enough, you will get life. Don't worry about it. Yes, it's strange. Yes, it's wonderful. But leave enough matter, 600 million years on Earth, and you will have life. So the monkey's sitting at the typewriter, and the chances are eventually he produces the complete works of Shakespeare, so what's the problem? So there's no problem. There isn't an issue, right? You just leave him long enough, you'll be fine. And at one keystroke a second, the monkey might well eventually get to the complete works of Shakespeare, but he doesn't manage to do it in 600 million years. So what I decided to do to run the numbers is instead of saying type the complete works of Shakespeare, I just ran the numbers for how long would it take a monkey typing at 1 keystroke a second to type to be or not to be, that is the question, right? On average, how long is it going to take my monkey friend at 1 keystroke a second? I don't know how long you think that would be. Maybe you could have a guess. Would it be less or more than 600 million years, which is the period life on Earth is supposed to have emerged within? And when I ran the numbers, to be or not to be, that is the question, takes 12.6 trillion years to type just that phrase. And a DNA string, which you have to have for the life we have now, doesn't emerge is not like a sentence's worth of information. A DNA string has got as much information as the Encyclopedia Britannica. Right? So if we're saying that emerged, something of that complexity emerged by chance, undirected, within 600 million years, again, it's mathematically possible, but it's so incredibly unlikely that it would have, that it tilts me in favor of the Christian story in which God creating life is simply a question of saying, let there be, and there was.
So it turns out that frogs, like I mentioned before, are incredibly diverse. So over 7,000 species. And many of them are nocturnal, so they live, they only come out at night. But there are some that come out during the daytime, and many of the ones that come out in the daytime have really, really bright colors. And the blue frogs, or the poison dart frogs, is one type of blue. There are many blue frogs, actually, but one type is called the poison dart frog. And the reason they're called that is because the native people in the Amazon in South America used to capture these frogs and take little darts and roll them on the skin of the frog, and they'd use that to shoot monkeys out of the trees. And it's because these frogs are incredibly toxic. They have neurotoxins on their skin. So they wear their armor basically on the outside of their skin. That's one of the things that makes frogs or amphibians different from other vertebrates, is that they have special glands that produce defensive compounds, mostly toxins, that if something tries to bite them, they get the toxin in their mouth, and then what happens to that predator is that their muscles stop working. So they can't bite, and they stop breathing. So some of them are really, really dangerous, actually. And most of the ones that are dangerous are out in the daytime. So they're flaunting their colors. They have very bright either reds or blues or oranges, and they're basically showing off their poisonousness, in a sense. Is that a word?
In the Western countries, women are becoming more and more reluctant to give birth to babies. However, the male status in society remains as strong as it ever has in recent years. The birth rates increased during the earliest 20th century, but it started to decrease over these last 2 decades. In the year 2000, as an example, the birth rate remained at around 1%. There are even some negative birth rates in other countries. Birth rates dropped to its lowest point that has never been seen in the society. It also has impacts on male in the society, especially young men, and it might have some connection with unemployment rates as well.
The comics I show you with lots of people chatting around in a room is a form of description. We use different kinds of methods to describe a situation. Sometimes we have to use visual description, particularly when we do not witness the scenario. I was born during the Second World War, and my hometown is X. For example, when I asked my mother about the war, I always ask her, "You have mentioned this or that when you talked to me when you asked her about the shelter. I asked her what the shelter looks like and when did you go to the shelter." From her response, I could get more visual evidence as I can to write my book.